the work that we do a lot of work with women, both in the fields of what's called WASH, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene, as well as in women's empowerment, women's upliftment, schools and women's centers, and just a lot of charitable work in those fields. And what's always struck me as so interesting is the greatest evils that we see perpetuated against young girls. Things like female genital mutilation, things like early child marriage, things like girls, not knowing about menstruation before they start menstruating. And that trauma. I mean, if you could imagine never hearing about menstruation and suddenly one day starting to pour blood, what that trauma would be like. And yet that's the case for about 70% of girls in India and in so many other parts of the world. And what's so interesting to me about this as we've done the work is that the perpetrators of that are not actually so much the fathers and uncles and grandfathers as they are the mothers, the aunts, and the grandmothers. And it took me a while to really wrap my head and my heart around that, around why a woman who herself had been genitally mutilated, a woman who had been married off at such a young age, a woman who had been through that trauma, wouldn't she be the first advocate to say, not my daughter? And yet what I realized as I thought more deeply about it and went really deeply into it is that in order for that woman to have lived her life without suffering the manifestations of PTSD, the manifestations of trauma, on some level, she had to tell herself it was okay. That which happened to her was okay. And in order to perpetuate that it was okayness, she vehemently needed to make sure it happened to her daughter. Because if she didn't make it happen to her daughter, what that would mean was it wasn't okay, which would mean that harm was done to her, which would mean that she had a level of suffering she needed to look at and examine, which she was not looking at. And it made me realize, and it's been something that I've been talking about to large groups of women all over the world, is our work as women needs to be to help other women heal. That it's not about so much the slogans and the campaigns and the, yes, there's a great role for that as well. And we're doing it, from sort of the world of the NGOs or the faith-based organizations to end child marriage, to bring about menstrual awareness, to end this trauma. And yet, what I think is so critical in this generational trauma lineage karma way is to help the mothers, grandmothers, aunts acknowledge and heal from what they experienced so that they can see it as not okay, but see themselves as okay. Let go of the guilt and shame that they carry, because if what happened was okay, it means I deserved it. It means there's something about me that needed to be cut, something that was bad about me. It means that any level of angst or trauma or anger that I feel is a problem with me because what happened was okay. So we need to help them heal that guilt, that shame, so they can heal the trauma, so they can finally put their foot down and say, not my daughter. And that's something that all of us, I just gave 3 examples, but there's so much in that wound that we pass down to our daughters, knowingly, unknowingly. When we don't do our work as women and heal our own issues, whatever they may be. Guilt is a huge one, shame is a huge one, but there's so many other huge ones. When we don't do that work and heal ourselves, we pass it on to our daughters. We've received it from our mothers, from our grandmothers. And at some point we need to say, enough. And that's where our beautiful healing comes in.